Among history's most remarkable figures, two men stand whose strength and leadership shaped the course of the 20th century, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Each emerged from vastly different beginnings, destined to command global attention through war, politics, and power. Let us begin with the first, Winston Churchill. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on the 30th of November in the year 1874 at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, England. What kind of child is born into a palace and ends up facing down dictators? How did this boy from a noble British family come to lead his nation through its darkest hour? And what were the personal battles behind his public courage? The answers lie in a life marked by destiny, discipline, and defiance. Please watch my full video until the end and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. Winston Churchill was born into the influential Spencer Churchill family, deeply rooted in British aristocracy. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a prominent conservative politician, while his mother, Jenny Jerome, came from a wealthy American background. Raised in the grand halls of Blenheim Palace, young Winston's early life was steeped in privilege, though not without hardship. His parents, often distant, left much of his upbringing to a devoted nanny named Elizabeth Everest, whom he later credited as his dearest companion. Though his surroundings were regal, Winston's childhood was marked by a yearning for attention and a struggle for approval. The boy who would one day rally a nation first had to survive the pressures of expectation, isolation, and emotional distance, seeds that quietly took root in the corridors of Blenheim. Winston Churchill's childhood soon gave way to the demanding world of British boarding schools, a realm of rigid discipline and unforgiving standards. At the age of 7, he began at St. George's School in Ascot, but struggled both academically and behaviorally. His rebellious spirit clashed with the rules, and his grades suffered. By the age of 10, he was transferred to Brunswick School in Hove, where his academic performance improved under a more nurturing environment. In April of 1888, 13-year-old Winston passed the entrance exam for Harrow School, one of Britain's most prestigious institutions. There, his father enrolled him in the Army Form, a specialized track for boys preparing for military careers. Though still inconsistent in many subjects, Churchill excelled in English composition and history, subjects that would later define his legacy as a writer and orator. His relationship with his father remained distant, and he was often desperate to prove himself worthy. That urgency only intensified when, after failing the entrance exam twice, he finally secured admission to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst on his third attempt in 1893. Opting for the cavalry instead of infantry to avoid higher academic requirements, Churchill was commissioned into the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in February 1895. For a boy who had once struggled to stay focused in class, the path ahead was now lined with military posts, foreign lands, and the fires of ambition. Winston Churchill was no longer just a boy of noble birth. He was a soldier in the making. Freshly commissioned and eager for action, Winston Churchill's early military career began not on British soil, but in distant lands filled with conflict and opportunity. In the autumn of 1895, with the help of his mother's connections, he traveled to Cuba to observe the Cuban War of Independence. There, embedded with Spanish forces, he witnessed combat for the first time and sent vivid reports back to the Daily Graphic in London, launching his parallel career as a war correspondent. Soon after, Churchill was posted to India with the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, stationed in Bangalore. For nearly 2 years, from 1896 to 1898, he immersed himself in both soldiering and self-education. He rayed widely, from Plato to Charles Darwin, and began to shape the political and philosophical views that would guide his future. His letters to his mother revealed a restless mind, grappling with issues of faith, empire, and duty. Churchill's thirst for action took him beyond routine service. In 1897, he volunteered for the Malakand field force fighting along the northwest frontier in what is now Pakistan. He participated in dangerous skirmishes and published his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, based on his experiences. By 1898, he had talked his way into another front, Sudan joining General Kitchener's campaign against the Mahdist forces. He rode in one of the last cavalry charges in British military history at the Battle of Omdurman and chronicled the brutal campaign in the River War. These early exploits weren't just about duty. They were Churchill's way of proving his courage, intellect, and resolve on the global stage. By the close of 1899, Winston Churchill had already seen more action than many seasoned officers. But it was the South African veld that would thrust him from relative obscurity into international fame. With tensions rising between Britain and the Boer republics, Churchill secured a commission as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, eager to cover the Second Boer War firsthand. Arriving in South Africa in October, he made his way to the front lines near Ladysmith. Just weeks into his assignment, he found himself aboard an armored train attacked by Boer forces during the Battle of Chiveli. Despite showing immense bravery under fire, Churchill was captured and taken as a prisoner of war to Pretoria. His imprisonment did not last long. In December 1899, under the cover of night, he escaped over the camp walls, traversed enemy territory by hiding in a coal train, and eventually reached safety in Portuguese East Africa. The daring escape captured headlines across the British Empire and turned Churchill into a national hero almost overnight. Seizing the moment, he returned briefly to military service, joining the South African Light Horse Regiment. He participated in key battles, including the relief of Ladysmith and the march to Pretoria. All the while, he was sending dispatches home, which were soon published as London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, a bestseller that enhanced both his public profile and bank account. Churchill had proven himself not only as a soldier and writer, but as a bold figure unafraid to risk everything for recognition and cause. With his fame soaring after the Boer War, Winston Churchill quickly turned his attention to politics, the arena where he believed he could make the greatest impact. In the general election of October 1900, he stood again as a Conservative candidate for Oldham, a constituency in northern England. This time, unlike his previous attempt, he was successful. At just 25 years old, he became a member of Parliament. In Parliament, Churchill quickly made waves. His maiden speech, delivered in February 1901, was widely praised and revealed his skill as a persuasive orator. But despite sitting with the Conservatives, Churchill often clashed with party leaders. He criticized their economic protectionism and supported social reforms more in line with liberal thinking. His views on trade, labor rights, and Irish policy grew increasingly progressive. Over the next few years, Churchill developed a reputation for independence. He aligned himself with the liberal imperialists, a group within the Liberal Party that supported moderate social reform and a strong empire. By 1904, tensions with conservative leadership had reached a breaking point. Churchill officially crossed the floor in Parliament, leaving the Conservatives to join the Liberal Party. His decision shocked many, but was a clear signal that Churchill would not be bound by party loyalty when it conflicted with his convictions. He wasn't interested in following, he was determined to lead, even if it meant starting over. This was the moment the future Prime Minister truly stepped into the political arena, not as a follower of tradition, but as a man prepared to shape it. Winston Churchill's switch to the Liberal Party in 1904 marked the beginning of his rapid ascent within British politics. By 1906, he had secured a seat representing Manchester North West and quickly gained favor within the new Liberal government. His energy, eloquence, and reformist zeal stood out, especially in matters of social justice and labor. In 1908, Prime Minister H.H. Asquith appointed Churchill as President of the Board of Trade, a senior cabinet position. At just 33 years old, he became one of the youngest cabinet ministers in British history. From this position, Churchill introduced major labor reforms. He played a key role in passing the Trade Boards Act, which helped establish minimum wages, and the Labor Exchanges Act, which created job centers to assist the unemployed. Working closely with fellow reformer David Lloyd George, Churchill promoted what he described as a network of state intervention aimed at improving the lives of Britain's working class. Though born into aristocracy, he advocated for social insurance, fair labor practices, and limits on exploitative employment. Churchill also showed courage in confronting controversy. He supported tax reforms to fund social programs and challenged the powerful House of Lords when it tried to block the people's budget in 1909. His growing influence helped push through the Parliament Act of 1911, which permanently reduced the Lords' power. Through these years, Churchill shed the image of a privileged military man and emerged as a dynamic and sometimes divisive political force. He was no longer merely the son of Lord Randolph Churchill. He was carving a name entirely his own. Winston Churchill's ministerial role expanded in 1910 when he was appointed Home Secretary, placing him in charge of Britain's law enforcement and prison system. With characteristic ambition, Churchill used this position to initiate a series of forward-thinking reforms that reflected his evolving social conscience. He sought to humanize the justice system, drawing a clear distinction between political prisoners and common criminals, and introduced measures to improve prison conditions. Under Churchill, prison libraries were established, solitary confinement rules were relaxed, and young offenders were given more lenient treatment. He commuted over 20 death sentences during his term, a bold move that sparked both praise and criticism. One of the most contentious issues of his tenure was the women's suffrage movement. Though Churchill expressed cautious support for giving women the right to vote, he insisted it must have backing from the male electorate. Suffragettes, unconvinced by his stance, targeted his public appearances with protests, even physical attacks. His handling of these protests, especially the violent clashes during the Black Friday demonstrations, left a lasting strain between Churchill and the women's rights movement. Churchill also faced fierce backlash for his role in the Tanapandy riots, where striking coal miners clashed with police. Though he tried to balance restraint with authority by delaying military involvement, he was still blamed by many for perceived harshness. These incidents complicated his image, admired for reforms, criticized for his responses to unrest. Yet through all this, Churchill's profile continued to grow. He was becoming a central figure in the struggle to define Britain's identity in a new century, one foot in tradition, the other pushing toward change. In October of 1911, Winston Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the Royal Navy. With war clouds gathering over Europe, this post placed him at the heart of Britain's military readiness. Churchill threw himself into modernizing the Navy, promoting new battleships, submarines, and naval aviation. He even championed the idea of aircraft carriers long before their time. Churchill insisted that for every German battleship, Britain would build 2. His efforts led to the purchase of a major stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to ensure the Navy had reliable fuel. Though some criticized his spending, Churchill believed naval superiority was Britain's lifeline. When World War I erupted in the summer of 1914, Churchill was among the first to act. He ordered the Royal Navy to mobilize and ensured British troops were safely transported to France. He also directed submarine operations in support of Russia and launched air defense initiatives at home. However, his leadership faced severe tests. In early 1915, he became the chief architect of the Dardanelles campaign, a bold plan to strike the Ottoman Empire through its naval defenses. When the naval attack failed, a land invasion at Gallipoli followed. That campaign, too, ended in tragedy with heavy Allied casualties and no breakthrough. Criticism rained down. Many in Parliament, especially Conservatives, blamed Churchill directly for the disaster. In May of 1915, as part of a political compromise, he was forced to resign from the Admiralty. It was a crushing blow. For a man so driven by ambition, to be cast out during wartime felt like exile, but Churchill was not done with history. He never would be. The Gallipoli campaign was intended to be a masterstroke, a daring naval and ground assault to knock the Ottoman Empire out of World War I and open a supply route to Russia. But what began as Winston Churchill's bold strategic vision quickly descended into chaos. In March of 1915, British and French naval forces attempted to force the Dardanelles Strait. When they met fierce resistance and heavy losses, the operation shifted to a land invasion. By April, Allied troops, including many from Australia and New Zealand, landed at Gallipoli. The terrain was brutal, the planning flawed, and the Ottoman defenders relentless. Despite months of fighting and enormous casualties, the Allies gained little ground. The campaign turned into a bloody stalemate. As First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill bore the brunt of the blame. Though he was not alone in shaping the plan, his forceful advocacy for the mission made him the political lightning rod. Critics in Parliament accused him of recklessness. Newspapers called for his removal. In May 1915, a political coalition forced Prime Minister Asquith to reshuffle the cabinet. One condition from the Conservatives: Churchill had to go. Stripped of his Admiralty post, he was demoted to Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, a ceremonial role he found unbearable. By November, humiliated and restless, Churchill resigned from the government altogether. He then took the extraordinary step of returning to military service, joining the British Army on the Western Front. It was a stunning fall from grace. Once hailed as a reformer and military visionary, Churchill now stood in the mud of Belgium, stripped of power, yet still determined to fight his way back. After months in the trenches during World War I, Winston Churchill returned to politics with fresh scars and renewed determination. Though his time on the Western Front had restored some of his public image, his path back to power would be cautious and slow. In 1917, under Prime Minister David Lloyd George, Churchill was appointed Minister of Munitions, a crucial role during wartime. There, he managed weapons production and negotiated with striking workers to keep factories running. Following the armistice in November 1918, Churchill's political star rose once again. He was appointed Secretary of State for War and for Air, overseeing the demobilization of millions of troops while managing unrest across the empire. He also led controversial efforts to support anti-Bolshevik forces in Russia during the Civil War, fearing the spread of communism. In 1921, he became Secretary of State for the colonies. In this role, he helped negotiate the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which brought an uneasy peace to Ireland after years of violence. He also worked to reshape British control in the Middle East, playing a hand in the rise of new monarchies in Iraq and Jordan. Yet not all his decisions were praised. His use of the black and tans during the Irish War of Independence and comments about using gas on tribal rebels sparked outrage. Despite his noble intentions to preserve stability, critics saw these policies as outdated imperialism. Churchill's return to government showed both brilliance and controversy. His vision was vast, but so too were the shadows cast by his choices, a reminder that power always comes with a price. The 1920s and 30s brought a sharp turn in Winston Churchill's political journey. After losing his seat in Dundee in 1922 and briefly returning in another constituency, Churchill faced a growing divide from both major parties. In 1924, he rejoined the Conservatives, but his views often clashed with party leadership, particularly over economic issues like returning Britain to the gold standard, a decision he later regretted. By the early 1930s, Churchill entered what he called his wilderness years. No longer in government, he found himself increasingly isolated from political power. But while others looked inward or turned complacent, Churchill remained vigilant, especially about the rising threat in Germany. As Adolf Hitler gained control of the Nazi Party and began rearming Germany, Churchill raised alarm after alarm in Parliament. He criticized Britain's disarmament policies and warned that another great war was looming. Many dismissed him as outdated, overly dramatic, or simply out of touch with the mood of appeasement that dominated the time. Churchill also opposed granting independence to India, a stance that further alienated him from progressive voices. But it was his unshakable focus on Hitler's regime that set him apart. He studied Germany's military build-up, wrote articles, and gave speeches urging Britain to rearm and prepare. Though ignored by many, his warnings would soon prove prophetic. Churchill's wilderness was not wasted. It was a season of sharpening. As the world inched closer to catastrophe, the man dismissed as a relic was quietly preparing for his greatest role yet, the wartime voice Britain didn't yet know it needed. On the 10th of May in the year 1940, with Europe engulfed in war and Nazi Germany advancing across the continent, Winston Churchill was appointed Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It was a moment of immense peril. France was on the brink of collapse, and Britain stood nearly alone against Adolf Hitler. Churchill's appointment came not through a sweeping election, but through resignation and crisis, as Neville Chamberlain stepped down and the nation turned to the one man whose voice had never wavered. Churchill immediately formed a coalition government and delivered a series of legendary speeches that rallied both Parliament and the public. In his first address, he offered nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. At a time of fear and uncertainty, his defiance gave hope. His words, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender," echoed beyond Britain's shores, symbolizing resistance in the face of tyranny. Throughout the war, Churchill coordinated closely with military leaders, strengthened ties with the United States and Soviet Union, and stood as the symbolic heart of Allied resolve. He navigated the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, and the darkest days when invasion seemed imminent. His relationship with President Franklin Roosevelt became the cornerstone of the Allied effort. Yet Churchill was not without flaws. He clashed with generals, made strategic missteps, and faced criticism at home. Still, his leadership kept Britain standing when it could easily have fallen. In a world consumed by war, Winston Churchill became more than a politician. He became the voice of courage. A wartime lion roaring into the storm, determined that Britain would never bow. Victory in Europe was declared in May of 1945. and Winston Churchill stood atop the world stage as the triumphant leader who had guided Britain through its darkest hour. Yet, in a twist of political irony, just 2 months later, the British people voted him out of office in a sweeping Labour Party victory. The war hero was suddenly a leader without a government. Though disappointed, Churchill accepted the result with characteristic grace. He became leader of the opposition and continued to shape global thought through speeches and writing. In March of 1946, at Westminster College in the United States, he delivered his now famous Iron Curtain speech, warning of Soviet expansion and the new threat of communist influence in Europe. This address marked the symbolic beginning of the Cold War. Churchill's voice once again became a moral compass. He urged unity between Britain and the United States and championed the idea of a united Europe to guard against future conflict. Though no longer in power, his words influenced policy and strategy across the Western world. In the late 1940s, he continued writing, publishing his 6-volume series The Second World War, which further solidified his reputation as a historian and statesman. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his writings and speeches. The man who once stood alone against fascism now stood as a prophet against the encroaching shadow of totalitarianism. Even without the title of Prime Minister, Winston Churchill remained the voice of warning, reason, and resolve in an uncertain world. In 1951, 6 years after his wartime defeat, Winston Churchill returned to power as Prime Minister at the age of 76. Older, slower, and more cautious, his second term lacked the fiery urgency of wartime, but it was no less significant. Now he governed not through crisis, but through legacy. At home, Churchill's government prioritized housing development and rebuilding the economy. He supported moderate social welfare reforms, maintaining key aspects of the post-war labor programs while cautiously managing Britain's post-imperial transition. His leadership was less about bold transformation and more about stability. Abroad, Churchill remained deeply focused on foreign policy. He worked tirelessly to maintain Britain's special relationship with the United States, especially under President Dwight Eisenhower. As the Cold War intensified, Churchill advocated for nuclear deterrence but also urged caution. In private, he longed for a summit between Western powers and the Soviet Union to prevent a future war. His health, however, was in steady decline. He suffered a serious stroke in 1953, a fact hidden from the public, and increasingly relied on close aides and his trusted deputy, Anthony Eden. Though he returned to work after a period of recovery, it was clear that age and illness were taking their toll. By April 1955, Churchill finally resigned as Prime Minister, ending a political career that had spanned over half a century. But even in retirement, he remained a symbol of Britain's resilience. He had not only led his nation through war, he had become its enduring voice in peace. Winston Churchill was now a living monument, the architect of courage, bearing the weight of history on his shoulders. After stepping down in 1955, Winston Churchill lived out his final years in quiet retirement, but never truly faded from public view. Though no longer in office, he remained a member of Parliament until 1964, marking over 6 decades of service to the nation. During this time, he continued to write, reflect, and receive international honors, including becoming the first person made an honorary citizen of the United States in 1963. Churchill spent much of his time at his beloved Chartwell estate, surrounded by family, painting landscapes, and revisiting memories of war and leadership. His health declined gradually, with strokes and fatigue limiting his public appearances. Even so, whenever he did emerge, whether at party conferences or state events, he was greeted with reverence and affection. On the 24th of January in the year 1965, Winston Churchill passed away at his home on Hyde Park Gate in London. He was 90 years old. The nation mourned deeply. A state funeral, the first for a commoner since the Duke of Wellington, was held at St. Paul's Cathedral and broadcast around the world. Thousands lined the streets, and millions watched in silence. Winston Churchill's legacy stretches beyond politics or war. He became a symbol of indomitable will, a voice that roared when others whispered, and a figure who shaped the destiny of nations. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Joseph Stalin was born on the 18th of December in the year 1878 in the town of Gori, nestled within the Russian Empire's Georgian province. How did this boy from a modest Georgian household rise to command the world's largest empire? What shaped the mind of a man who would come to be both feared and worshipped across continents? And what truths lie buried beneath the iron mask of revolution, power, and repression? Stalin was born Iosif Bessarionis Dze Jughashvili, the son of a cobbler named Bessarion and a deeply religious mother named Ketevan. His early life was marked by hardship. His father, often drunk and violent, eventually abandoned the family, leaving young Iosif in the care of his devout and determined mother. She dreamed he would enter the priesthood, a future far removed from the path he would take. Gori was a rough town where street fights were common and education was a privilege. But despite limited means, Iosif excelled in school, showing a sharp mind and a gift for language. He was fluent in Georgian and later learned Russian, though he never lost his strong accent. These early years were filled with contradictions, religious studies mixed with rebellion, poverty alongside ambition. Physically small and suffering from a childhood accident that left one arm slightly deformed, he was often underestimated. Yet even as a boy, Stalin displayed resilience, cunning, and a growing disdain for authority. The seeds of steel were already taking root in Gori's red soil. In the autumn of 1894, 16-year-old Iosif Jughashvili arrived in Tiflis, the capital of Georgia, to enroll in the Tiflis Theological Seminary. For his mother, this was a dream fulfilled. She hoped her only son would rise through the church and find peace in faith. But within the seminary's high stone walls, young Iosif began to change. Though an outstanding student, he grew increasingly disillusioned with religious doctrine. The seminary's harsh discipline, rigid routines, and frequent beatings sparked resentment rather than devotion. More importantly, the school became a breeding ground for revolutionary ideas. Forbidden texts by Karl Marx and other socialist thinkers circulated secretly among students, and Iosif eagerly absorbed their radical energy. He began questioning authority, not just the seminary's priests, but the entire imperial system of the Russian czars. He started skipping prayers, challenging teachers, and organizing protests. In 1899, he was expelled, officially for missing exams, but more likely for his growing subversive behavior. By then, he had already adopted a new identity in the shadows of revolution. Taking on the alias Koba, after a Georgian folk hero, he joined underground Marxist circles in Tiflis. He wrote articles, delivered speeches, and organized workers in railway yards and oil fields. His ability to inspire fear and loyalty made him stand out. In April of 1902, Stalin was arrested for the first time while leading a May Day rally in Batumi. It would not be his last encounter with the czarist police, but rather than weaken him, prison only sharpened his resolve. From the fading corridors of a seminary to the cells of imperial prisons, Stalin's transformation was already underway. After his first arrest in 1902, Iosif Jughashvili, now increasingly known as Koba, was deported to Siberia. But exile could not contain his ambition. Over the next decade, he would escape multiple times, join conspiracies, and rise steadily through the ranks of Russia's fractured revolutionary movement. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, divided between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, became Stalin's political home. Though he initially sympathized with the Mensheviks, he soon gravitated toward the hardline Bolsheviks led by Vladimir Lenin. Their commitment to centralized authority and radical revolution matched his instincts for control and discipline. Stalin became a trusted party organizer, particularly valued for his work among ethnic minorities and in Georgia. He wrote in underground newspapers, managed smuggling routes for printing presses, and orchestrated bold robberies to fund the cause, including the infamous Tiflis Bank heist of 1907, which left dozens dead, but filled the Bolshevik coffers. He also gained a reputation for secrecy and ruthlessness. While others debated ideology, Stalin focused on networks, logistics, and loyalty. He operated in Baku, Batumi, and St. Petersburg, always in motion, always under threat of arrest. By the time of the Russian Revolution's first wave in 1905, Stalin had become indispensable to the Bolshevik underground. His relationship with Lenin deepened, built on shared purpose rather than friendship. Though less known than intellectuals like Trotsky or Bukharin, Stalin's power was growing behind the scenes. He was not a theorist, he was a builder of systems, enforcer of order, and master of survival. In the shadows of revolution, Joseph Stalin was no longer just a follower. He was positioning himself as one of its most dangerous architects. By the time the Russian monarchy collapsed in the February Revolution of 1917, Joseph Stalin had become a seasoned revolutionary. He returned to Petrograd from exile that March, just as the Russian provisional government struggled to hold power. Stalin rejoined the Bolshevik leadership and began editing Pravda, the party's newspaper, shaping its message during a time of growing unrest. When Lenin arrived from abroad, he quickly pushed the Bolsheviks toward a full seizure of power. Stalin supported him, though he remained in the background compared to figures like Trotsky. Yet during the October Revolution, Stalin played a key logistical role, securing communication lines, coordinating armed units, and ensuring strategic areas were under Bolshevik control. After the Bolsheviks seized power, Russia plunged into civil war. From 1918 to 1921, Stalin was dispatched to critical fronts across the collapsing empire. In Tsaritsyn, later renamed Stalingrad, he oversaw brutal campaigns against White Army forces, including mass executions of suspected traitors. His methods were severe, but effective, earning him both fear and favor within the party. He clashed bitterly with other commanders, including Trotsky, over tactics and authority. While Trotsky led the Red Army as a whole, Stalin managed regional campaigns with ruthless independence. His reputation as an enforcer solidified, a man who would crush resistance at any cost. The Civil War forged the Soviet state, and Stalin was there at every critical juncture. Though he was not the face of the revolution, he became its iron fist. Quietly, relentlessly, he was moving closer to the center of power, and building the machinery he would one day control entirely. As the Russian Civil War began to wind down in the early 1920s, Joseph Stalin's influence within the Bolshevik hierarchy deepened. Though not a public speaker like Trotsky or an intellectual theorist like Bukharin, Stalin had won Lenin's trust through loyalty, discipline, and efficiency. In 1922, this trust was rewarded with a pivotal appointment. Stalin became General Secretary of the Communist Party. At first glance, the position appeared bureaucratic, even dull. But Stalin recognized its hidden power. As General Secretary, he controlled appointments, internal communications, and access to key information. Slowly, methodically, he began placing loyal supporters into strategic roles across the party and government. It was administrative work, but it laid the foundation for dominance. During these years, Lenin's health began to fail. After suffering a series of strokes, Lenin became increasingly concerned about Stalin's growing influence and harsh methods. In his final writings, known as Lenin's Testament, he criticized Stalin, even suggesting he be removed from his post. But Lenin's death in January of 1924 came before any action could be taken. Stalin moved quickly to suppress the testament and presented himself as Lenin's natural heir. In the struggle that followed, Stalin used his network of allies and his grip on party machinery to isolate rivals, especially Trotsky, who had once been considered Lenin's likely successor. With Lenin gone and his enemies sidelined, Stalin stood at the edge of absolute power. The revolution was no longer in the hands of dreamers or poets. It now belonged to a man who valued control over vision, a man prepared to shape the future by force. Joseph Stalin's role as General Secretary, acquired in 1922, became the keystone of his rise to unchecked power. While others focused on ideology or policy debates, Stalin mastered the machinery of the Communist Party. He quietly filled key posts with loyal supporters, building a network that spanned local committees, regional offices, and central organs. Through quiet manipulation and relentless organization, he turned the party into a vehicle for personal rule. Following Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin launched a calculated campaign to eliminate his rivals. The most formidable was Leon Trotsky, brilliant, charismatic, and widely viewed as Lenin's intellectual equal. Stalin first allied with figures like Zinoviev and Kamenev to isolate Trotsky, portraying him as arrogant and disloyal. Once Trotsky was weakened and exiled from the party in 1927, Stalin turned on his former allies. By the early 1930s, most of the old Bolsheviks who had shared power during the revolution were either demoted, silenced, or eliminated. Stalin used party congresses, propaganda, and loyalty purges to tighten his grip. Political opponents were accused of factionalism, a dangerous label in Stalin's system, and forced to recant or disappear entirely. Stalin's transformation of the General Secretary role was unprecedented. What had begun as a desk job now controlled the levers of state. The Communist Party no longer served a collective vision. It obeyed one man. By ruthlessly dismantling all opposition, Stalin reshaped the Soviet Union into a dictatorship. The age of collective leadership was over. The era of total domination had begun, and Joseph Stalin was now its unquestioned architect. By the late 1920s, Joseph Stalin launched one of the most sweeping and devastating policies in Soviet history: forced collectivization. Determined to transform the Soviet Union from a rural peasant society into a modern industrial power, Stalin believed that private farms were obstacles to progress. His solution was brutal: consolidate millions of small farms into large, state-controlled collectives. The policy was enforced with violence. Wealthier peasants, labeled kulaks, were branded enemies of the state. Many were arrested, deported, or executed. Armed officials stormed villages, seizing grain, livestock, and tools. Entire communities were uprooted as resistance was met with ruthless punishment. Nowhere did the suffering run deeper than in Ukraine. As one of the Soviet Union's most fertile regions, Ukraine was forced to meet impossible grain quotas. When villagers hid or withheld food, Stalin responded with blockades, food confiscations, and blacklisting entire areas. The result was catastrophic. Between 1932 and 1933, a man-made famine, later known as the Holodomor, swept through Ukraine. Millions starved to death in silence. Families resorted to eating bark, roots, and even more horrifying measures. The Soviet state denied the famine's existence, even as grain was exported abroad to fund industrialization. While factories rose in Moscow and Leningrad, the countryside withered in agony. Stalin never expressed remorse. To him, the famine was a necessary cost for building socialism. Collectivization reshaped Soviet agriculture and solidified Stalin's control over the peasantry, but it also left behind a legacy of death, trauma, and unspeakable cruelty, a haunting chapter in the shadow of Stalin's ambition. While collectivization ravaged the countryside, Joseph Stalin turned his gaze toward the cities. Determined to make the Soviet Union an industrial superpower, he launched a series of ambitious 5-year plans beginning in 1928. These blueprints aimed to transform the Soviet economy through rapid growth in steel, coal, oil, and manufacturing. Giant factories sprang up across the nation. Dams, railroads, and mines were built with astonishing speed. Cities like Magnitogorsk and Dnipro became symbols of Soviet progress. Propaganda hailed heroic workers, Stakhanovites, who exceeded quotas and embodied socialist devotion. But behind the public triumphs lay an invisible cost: exhaustion, danger, and the exploitation of millions. To fuel these grand projects, Stalin expanded the Gulag system, a sprawling network of labor camps where prisoners toiled in brutal conditions. Political dissidents, petty criminals, religious believers, and even loyal party members were arrested and sent away, often without trial. In remote forests, tundras, and mines, they worked in extreme cold, malnourished, and abused. Many never returned. The gulags became both a tool of terror and a source of labor. Entire industries relied on their workforce, from gold mining in Kolyma to canal building near Moscow. By the mid-1930s, the camps held over 1 million people, and the numbers kept rising. Stalin's industrialization catapulted the Soviet Union from backwardness to global prominence, but the price was staggering. Progress came not through innovation or consent, but through fear and force. Factories rose, but so did graves. In Stalin's world, steel and suffering were forged side by side. In the mid-1930s, Joseph Stalin unleashed a reign of terror so profound that it scarred the very soul of the Soviet Union. Known as the Great Purge, this campaign sought to eliminate anyone Stalin perceived as a threat, real or imagined, within the Communist Party, the military, and across society. It began quietly in 1934 after the assassination of Sergei Kirov, a rising party leader in Leningrad. Though the killer was quickly executed, Stalin used the incident to justify a sweeping crackdown. He claimed conspiracies lurked in every corner: traitors, spies, saboteurs, and only total vigilance could protect the revolution. Over the next 4 years, mass arrests became routine. Soviet citizens lived in dread of the dreaded knock on the door at night. Former allies, senior officials, generals, poets, and factory workers alike were swept into the abyss. Many were tortured until they confessed to absurd crimes. Others were forced to implicate friends and family. The infamous Moscow trials, public show trials held between 1936 and 1938, paraded prominent Bolsheviks before the world, only to sentence them to death after coerced confessions. Even the military was not spared. Hundreds of officers, including the Red Army's top commanders, were executed, crippling Soviet defense at the worst possible time. By the end of the purge, an estimated 700,000 people had been executed and millions more imprisoned. Fear became a daily reality. Loyalty was meaningless. paranoia ruled. Stalin had secured absolute control, but at the cost of trust, truth, and the blood of his own people. The revolution had devoured its children, and Stalin stood alone at its head. By the late 1930s, Joseph Stalin stood as the unchallenged ruler of the Soviet Union. But beyond his borders, Europe was inching toward war. As Adolf Hitler expanded Nazi Germany's power and annexed territory across Central Europe, Western democracies hesitated. Stalin watched warily, weighing his next move. For years, the Soviet Union had condemned fascism and called for collective resistance. But Stalin distrusted the West just as deeply as he feared Hitler. Secretly, he began negotiating with both sides. Then, in a shocking turn, he chose a deal with his ideological enemy. On the 23rd of August in the year 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that stunned the world. Behind its public language of peace was a hidden clause. Stalin and Hitler had agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Days later, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. On the 17th of September, Stalin's forces marched in from the east. Poland was erased, and Europe was plunged into war. Stalin also seized the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and parts of Finland and Romania. This cynical alliance gave Stalin breathing room to prepare for war and expand his territory. But it came at a moral cost. Millions of people fell under Soviet rule, and thousands were deported or killed. Western trust in the Soviet Union evaporated. Stalin had gambled that Hitler would honor the pact, but the uneasy peace would not last. In striking a bargain with tyranny, Stalin had bought time, but also sealed a future betrayal written in blood. In the early hours of June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany shattered its pact with the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, sent over 3 million German soldiers across the Soviet border. Stalin, caught off guard, was silent for days. His gamble on peace with Hitler had failed catastrophically. The Red Army suffered devastating early losses. Cities fell, entire armies were encircled, and thousands of soldiers were taken prisoner. Stalin remained in Moscow, gripped by shock, but soon emerged to deliver a radio address rallying the nation. He invoked not just socialism, but Russian patriotism, calling on every citizen to defend the motherland. As the war deepened, Stalin assumed direct command of the military as supreme commander. He made brutal decisions, scorched earth policies, summary executions of deserters, and orders forbidding retreat. Yet his resolve held. Factories were moved east of the Ural Mountains, producing tanks and planes at an astonishing pace. Women and children worked alongside men to keep the Soviet war machine alive. The turning point came in Stalingrad, where Soviet forces halted and then crushed a massive German offensive. The battle, lasting from late 1942 into early 1943, became a symbol of Soviet resilience and sacrifice. By 1945, Soviet troops pushed deep into Eastern Europe and stormed Berlin. Hitler was dead. The war was won. Stalin emerged as a global victor, celebrated in the West but feared at home. His leadership had saved the Soviet Union, but at a price of over 20 million lives. The Soviet flag now flew over ruins, both abroad and within. As World War II ended in 1945, Joseph Stalin stood among the victors, yet his ambitions did not rest. With the Red Army occupying much of Eastern Europe, Stalin moved quickly to transform liberated territories into loyal satellite states. Through pressure, rigged elections, and political purges, countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany fell under Soviet influence. What had begun as wartime cooperation between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill rapidly dissolved into mistrust. Stalin refused to allow democratic governments in Eastern Europe, violating promises made at the Yalta Conference. He saw Western ideals as a threat and believed security could only come through control. The Cold War was beginning. In the West, former allies viewed Stalin's actions as aggressive and expansionist. In response, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, an offer Stalin rejected for his sphere. The world split into two camps: capitalist democracies in the West, communist regimes in the East. In 1948, Stalin escalated tensions by blockading West Berlin, attempting to starve Allied forces out of the divided city. But the Berlin airlift, a massive supply effort by the Western powers, foiled his plan. It was a humiliating failure, but Stalin held tight. Domestically, he tightened his grip further. Anti-Semitic purges, show trials, and censorship returned. Loyalty was demanded not just in speech, but in thought. Stalin had not only won a war, he had drawn a curtain across Europe. Behind it lay a world ruled by surveillance, fear, and obedience. The Soviet Empire had expanded, but so had its isolation. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and Stalin stood firmly behind it. By the late 1940s, Joseph Stalin was no longer just the leader of the Soviet Union, he had become its living symbol. His image towered over public squares, his portraits filled classrooms and factories, and his name was spoken with reverence or not at all. The cult of personality had reached its peak, transforming a man into a myth. This glorification was not accidental. Propaganda depicted Stalin as the father of nations, brilliant genius of humanity, and great architect of communism. Official histories erased rivals and credited him with every Soviet success. Children were taught to idolize him. Writers, composers, and scientists praised him in carefully worded tributes, or faced censorship, exile, or death. Beneath this adoration lay a totalitarian system built on fear. The secret police, first the NKVD, then the MGB, monitored citizens relentlessly. A careless joke, a misinterpreted word, or even a failure to show enthusiasm could lead to arrest. Millions remained in labor camps, forgotten by the outside world. Stalin demanded unwavering obedience, not only in politics, but in every corner of life. Science, art, agriculture all had to conform to his will. When Soviet scientists pursued genetics research that clashed with Marxist principles, Stalin endorsed fake theories that set science back for decades. Even his closest allies were not safe. In his final years, Stalin's paranoia intensified. He reshuffled ministries, dismissed doctors, and hinted at another purge. The Soviet Union was no longer a state with a leader. It was a nation consumed by one man's vision and imprisoned by one man's shadow. Power had become absolute, and so had the fear it fed. As Joseph Stalin entered the twilight of his rule in the early 1950s, his health and mental state began to decline. He became increasingly reclusive, erratic, and suspicious of those closest to him. Longtime allies, such as Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Secret Police Chief Lavrenti Beria, fell in and out of favor without warning. Loyalty offered no protection, only survival through silence. Stalin's paranoia deepened. In 1952, he convened the 19th Party Congress, the first in over a decade, and used it to reshuffle the leadership. He created a new presidium, a larger governing body designed to dilute power among top officials. But beneath the structural changes lay old fears. Stalin suspected betrayal everywhere. One of the most chilling episodes was the so-called doctor's plot in 1953. Prominent Soviet doctors, many of them Jewish, were accused of conspiring to poison senior officials. Though the evidence was fabricated, mass arrests followed, and rumors spread that Stalin was preparing for a new purge, one that could rival the terror of the 1930s. Meanwhile, Stalin's physical health deteriorated. He suffered from high blood pressure, hardened arteries, and bouts of dizziness. Yet no one dared suggest he step down. Ministers and guards tiptoed around him, terrified of even the smallest misstep. At night, Stalin dined alone or with a shrinking circle of confidants, often ranting late into the early hours. He read secret police reports obsessively and trusted no one, not even his doctors. The world waited, unsure when or how Stalin's rule would end. Inside the Kremlin's darkened halls, a storm was gathering, and the man who once commanded empires was now trapped by the empire he had created. On the 5th of March in the year 1953, Joseph Stalin suffered a massive stroke at his dacha near Moscow. Guards delayed calling for help, and he lay unattended for hours. He died 4 days later on the 5th of March at the age of 74. His death triggered national mourning. Massive crowds flooded the streets, and chaos at his funeral led to several deaths. Stalin's body was placed beside Lenin's in Red Square, a gesture of symbolic permanence. But the silence following his death grew louder. Within years, his successors began dismantling the image he had so carefully built. In 1956, Khrushchev's secret speech exposed Stalin's brutal purges and cult of personality. Monuments came down, and fear slowly gave way to reckoning. Stalin had changed the world through terror and power. Whether seen as savior or oppressor, his legacy remains deeply divisive and enduring. What do you think about Winston Churchill? Was Churchill the indomitable voice of freedom, a wartime hero whose words and willpower steered a nation through its darkest hour? Or a complicated figure, burdened by controversy, empire, and decisions that left deep scars across continents? And what about Joseph Stalin? Was Stalin the architect of victory, a relentless leader who turned a rural nation into a global power and stood firm against Nazi aggression? Or was he a tyrant, ruling through fear, famine, and purges, leaving millions silenced in his pursuit of control? Were these men guardians of their nations, or symbols of ambition unchecked? Did their legacies protect future generations or haunt them in silence? History does not offer simple answers, only the echoes of power, sacrifice, and consequence. Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past. Stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.